The hearing will come to order. Today's Environment Subcommittee will begin a series of budget hearings for fiscal year 2020, starting with the Department of Interior. Joining us this morning is Mr. Scott Cameron, Principal Deputy Secretary of the Office of Policy, Management, and Budget. In his career, Mr. Cameron earlier was a political appointee at the department during President George W. Bush's administration. He's also worked at the Office of Management and Budget on Capitol Hill, and we appreciate him being here this morning. Accompanying Mr. Cameron is Ms. Denise Flanagan, the Director of the Department's Office of Budget. Ms. Flanagan has served as a federal employee for 28 years. Wow. Which has been, she's been in her current position for the last 9, which means she really understands the budget well. So thank you for helping us answer any questions on how the department's money is spent. We really appreciate having you here. Before we begin, I want to advise my colleagues that we'll be hearing from David Bernhardt, the acting secretary, at a later time. Mr. Bernhardt's scheduled to have his confirmation hearing in the Senate this week, so Mr. Joyce and I have agreed to temporarily postpone his appearance before our subcommittee. We look forward from hearing from him after his confirmation, should the Senate do so. For fiscal year 2020, however, the Interior Department is seeking $11.4 billion for the Bureau's program funded through the Interior Appropriations Bill. But let me be clear about what the $11.4 billion means. It means that President Trump is asking for a $1.6 billion cut, or 12% from the current enacted level. Those cuts include $234 million from operations from the National Park Service and Fish and Wildlife Service and the Bureau of Land Management. That means fewer park rangers helping visitors, fewer resources to support endangered species, and less attention to protecting natural habitats on our public lands. A $197 million decrease for deferred maintenance accounts in those 3 agencies. And that means, as all of us have been working on, we will see the backlog grow while public land is left unsafe with trails, campsites, docks, and deteriorating bridges, and resources not put towards fixing them. $177 million out of the U.S. Geological Survey, with most of the cuts targeted towards science programs. And that includes eliminating Research Division of the Environmental Health and cutting 5 of the 8 climate science centers. $231 billion being cut from the Bureau of Indian Affairs and the Bureau of Indian Education construction account. This cut would undermine the years of bipartisan work of our subcommittee that we have done to meet the growing needs and obligations to our Native American students who are attending unsafe and unhealthy schools. We take our treaty and trust responsibility in this committee very seriously. The $277 million from the Land and Water Conservation Fund, leaving a mere $6 million for actual projects. Now, this cut was proposed even though within days of releasing the budget, the President signed legislation, which we passed overwhelmingly in Congress, to permanently reauthorize the LWCF. Alongside these destructive cuts, the Department is proposing to spend $27 million to continue what I believe is an ill-advised and poorly documented reorganizational proposal that's long on platitudes but very short on verifiable facts. And Mr. Bernhardt had been working with the staff on this before, but we still have more questions that have not been answered. So to sum up, the severity of these proposed cuts is dangerous. The funding levels in the Trump budget cause needless worry on the part of many Americans who care deeply about our public lands and people who work to protect them. Our constituents see these cuts thinking that this is the final say, and imagine that services and opportunities in our parks, our wildlife refuge, and BLM will be severely cut. Tribal nations will, and I know, see these cuts as an abandonment of our trust and treaty responsibilities, and they fear what will happen to them next year. Millions of Americans living along the full length of the Atlantic and the Pacific coasts are wondering if their governors, who unanimously oppose drilling off their coasts, will be heard. For the administration to offer these proposals to recklessly slash the federal budgets is a disservice to this country, in my opinion. This is not only thoughtful consideration about what funding levels are actually needed to carry out the mission of the department. Instead, this is nothing more to me than an exercise of how to hit an arbitrary allocation passed down from OMB. It is clear that the administration is embarrassed by its disastrous management of the deficit, which is expected to top $1 trillion this year. And now the president is trying to balance the budget by slashing funds for our national parks and public lands to finance his tax cuts for the wealthy and also for him to be able to afford his border wall. It's unfortunate, but as appropriators, we will work through this. We will produce a bill that better reflects the will of our constituents. And as a fellow friend and appropriator who I've been quoting often over the past couple months has said, Mr. Cole, and I quote, "The administration proposes, Congress disposes." So before turning to Mr. Cameron, I'd like to yield to our ranking member, Mr. Joyce, for any opening remarks he would like to make.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and welcome, Mr. Cameron and Ms. Flanagan. Thank you for being here today on relatively short notice. I'm pleased to know that Mr. Bernhardt's confirmation is proceeding. There's a shortage of leadership throughout the Department of Interior, as you both know, and the sooner people are confirmed and installed, the better it will be for all of us. We have before us today a fiscal year 2020 discretionary budget proposal for the Department of Interior that has been drafted in accordance with the budget cap reduction mandated by current law. Interior's contribution is a $1.6 billion, 12% cut from the FY19 enacted levels. Whether the Congress and the President can agree on changes to the budget caps for FY20 remains open to be seen. If we can, and if we can prioritize, then some question will do it for us. So for the time being, this proposal is necessary and useful exercise in prioritization, even though I disagree with some of the choices proposed. Most notably, this budget scales back the federal investment in the Great Lakes ecosystem. Funding for the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative is reduced by 90%. Asian carp control and prevention is cut by $5.1 million. Harmful algal bloom research is cut by $2.3 million. These programs and more are important not only to my constituents, but to the constituents of many of my colleagues around this table. I will be working with my colleagues, and particularly my chair, in the coming weeks to ensure that these programs continue. Another trouble spot is the maintenance of the national park system. Many people know by now that the maintenance backlog has grown to nearly $12 billion. That alarming number has prompted several important initiatives that we can all be proud of, like the Centennial Challenge and the proposed Public Lands Infrastructure Fund, which will help to significantly reduce the backlog. But we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that the Park Service's cyclical maintenance budget isn't keeping up with the need, and so it's adding to the backlog each year. This FY20 budget proposal is moving cyclical maintenance in the wrong direction by cutting it nearly $18 million. Should we really be trying to cut the maintenance backlog with one hand while adding to it with another? Despite these and other trouble spots in the budget proposal, there are some bright spots that merit highlighting and which the department deserves credit. The first is forest management. FY20 marks the first year of implementation of the fire fix, which will provide an additional $2.3 billion of suppression funding outside the subcommittee's allocation if needed, so long as this amount equivalent to the FY15 suppression costs are appropriated in this bill, which this budget proposes to do. Not only does this budget help to end the practice of fire borrowing, it proposes to more actively manage the forests and prevent catastrophic wildfires from happening in the first place. As long as active forest management is done responsibly and sustainably, I'm all for it. Another bright spot is this budget proposal to consolidate the department's Indian education responsibilities into a truly autonomous Bureau of Indian Education. It's clear this proposal is in direct response to the recommendations by the Government Accountability Office, or GAO, and directions by this subcommittee. As they say, the devil's in the details, but I look forward to working with my chair to do everything we can to help the Bureau of Indian Education succeed for the sake of the 46,000 elementary and secondary students who rely on it. With that, I thank you again for being here today, Mr. Cameron. I look forward to your testimony and our discussion today, and I thank the chair for yielding me time, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Cameron. We'll proceed, and your full testimony will be submitted to the record. And so if you have a summary testimony you wish to give us, and then refer to full testimony as needed with questions, that's fine. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. McCollum. Yes, would very much like to have our full testimony submitted for the record, and I do have a brief opening statement. So, Chair McCollum, Ranking Member Joyce, and Ms. Pingree, I'd like to thank you for giving me the opportunity to testify in support of President Trump's FY 2020 budget for the Department of the Interior. I'd also like to add my congratulations, as I understand that I'm among the first witnesses to appear before you as chair and ranking member in your new roles. As was indicated earlier, I am the Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary for Policy Management and Budget at Interior. And much like you, I'm delighted to have Denise Flanagan joining us today. Interior's total budget request for 2020 is $12.6 billion, $11.5 billion of which is before the subcommittee, the balance being in the Bureau of Reclamation, and that's in the Energy and Water Appropriations Subcommittee. Thanks to this subcommittee, we will have another $300 million available for fire suppression if there is another severe fire season. I'm pleased to be able to share with you that the President's 2020 budget for Interior is nearly $1 billion above the President's 19 request for Interior. This additional investment on the part of the White House, we believe, signals both the significance of our programs and the results that we deliver for the American people. At the same time, our budget is fiscally responsible. Looking at our 2020 request, you'll see we've prioritized investment in our core land and resource management operations. The services and results Americans rely on us to deliver on the ground every day in national parks, wildlife refuges, and on our public lands. We do emphasize taking care of the land the Congress has already asked us to manage rather than acquiring new lands. That's a correct observation. Programmatically, our objective is to strike the right balance between resource protection and sustainable use of America's resources. At a high level, this budget invests in 5 broad goals: promote collaborative conservation, support safe and secure communities, strengthen America's energy and mineral security, honor our trust responsibilities, and reorganize the Department of the Interior to make us more responsive to the American people. Associated with our funding request are 2 important legislative proposals. One on active forest management, which we hope will be transmitted to the Congress any day now, and the reproposal of the Public Lands Infrastructure Fund. These pieces of legislation will significantly advance our ability to proactively reduce wildland fire risks and costs and care for Interior's iconic infrastructure that I know this committee cares a great deal about. I'd like to take just a moment to mention 3 topics. First, the budget for wildland fire overall totals about $920 million, including $194 million for fuels management, which represents about $10 million above the 2019 enacted level. This investment will help improve the health of Interior's forest and rangelands while reducing the wildland fire risk for adjacent landowners as well. Second, strengthening Interior's infrastructure remains a priority. Our budget does include $1.5 billion for maintenance and construction across Interior. Third, the administration's emphasis on education is reflected in the fact that for the first time, the Bureau of Indian Education is presented in the budget as a distinct entity. It is no longer simply part of the Bureau of Indian Affairs. Under President Trump's leadership, the Department of the Interior has accomplished much on behalf of the American people in the past 2 years. Our 2020 budget enables us to continue to deliver these results and remain fiscally responsible. I'm happy to take your questions, and as always, we look forward to working with the subcommittee as it does its important work in the months ahead. So thank you very much, Chair McCollum and Mr. Joyce, Ms. Pingree, and look forward to the conversation.
Thank you. We have a timer up here, but there's just 3 of us here right now, and we want to be able to have a good discussion. So we're going to use this as a guide. We're not going to be as firm as Mr. Joyce and I were when we had how many hours of public witness testimony, and we didn't want to back people up and have them miss flights to leave. We have this kind of as a guide so that we share time. As you know, Congress specifies in detail how appropriated funds and adjustments are spent. And we know that adjustments may be necessary due to unforeseen circumstances. To account for this, Congress gives agencies some flexibility to shift funds. However, the agency's ability to do this is restricted by limiting provisions, also referred to as reprogramming guidelines. Nearly all the appropriations subcommittees carry reprogramming guidelines in the text bill. Agriculture, Commerce and Justice, Defense, Energy and Water, Financial Services, Labor, HHS, State and Foreign Operations, Military VA Construction, Transportation, Housing, all carry bill texts. And I would say, as members of the Full Appropriation Committee, we serve on committees that have this in their full text. Interior is the one exception. So for the past few years, we've been working to transition Interior in the bill so that there is consistency across all the subcommittees. Throughout this process, we have asked the department for drafting input so we get it right for the department. And to be frank, the department has been resisted this effort and has been clearly uncooperative. So, Mr. Cameron, I have a couple of questions. Why has the department refused to provide the technical assistance we've requested so we get this reprogramming text in the bill right so it works for everyone? Can you outline what makes the Department of Interior so unique from the other agencies funded by the 9 other subcommittees that are included in reprogramming guidelines in their appropriation bills? And then I have 2 other questions after you answer those 2 that are kind of together about why we're not getting where we need to be with reprogramming text in our bill. But I want to know from your opinion, because I have mine, is the department following the current reprogramming guidelines? And did the department follow reprogramming guidelines during the shutdown?
Chairman Collins, thank you for that question. I think that the short answer is we are very mindful of the reprogramming guidelines that are in report language. We've worked with this subcommittee and your colleagues on the Senate side, I think, to modify that language to meet your changing needs or your changing interests over time. So we do think that we've been responsive. In terms of why are we different than all the other agencies and all the other subcommittees, I don't know all those other departments. Obviously, that well I know my own. I would suggest that we, from our perception, is at least that we have abided by the committee's reprogramming guidelines, and that therefore the relationship has worked. So if that's in fact the case, then we don't see an obvious value for having the reprogramming language in statute. We do have some complications, particularly in our National Park Service. They seem to need to have the flexibility to move money around from line item to line item, which makes drafting any sort of statutory requirement challenging. So those are my initial thoughts on that subject, Chair McCollum.
Well, Mr. Cameron, I find what you've shared with us unacceptable. We expect the Department of Interior to work with us. We all serve on the other committees. There's nothing that I see as insurmountable. I mean, we made the Forest Service statutorily subject to reprogramming guidelines. They're also in Interior. The Bureau of Reclamation, which is part of the department under the jurisdiction of Energy and Water, has been able to do it. And there hasn't been any problems with this. And we want to have consistency as appropriators across the board. And as I mentioned, this is something that isn't a new Democratic proposal. This is something that we've been working on bipartisanly and with the Senate on. I also find your comment on the Park Service being able to have flexibility with shifting funds around, especially in light of what happened during the shutdown with taking the fees and shifting them and using them for day-to-day operation, which is being actually looked into now by the Inspector General, GAO, excuse me. We have so many things being looked into by GAO. I find your response unacceptable, and the committee expects to get a submission back from you, a timeline when we can expect to see some text moving forward so that we get it right the first time. And with that, I yield to Mr. Joyce for a question.
Thank you, Madam Chair. As you know, the FY20 budget proposes that the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative funding from $300 million down to $30 million. Some here may call me a one-trick pony about the Great Lakes, but this is very important to us. Although funding for this program resides with the EPA's budget, it's been understood from the beginning that funds are to be coordinated and shared with other agencies. With that in mind, can you tell us whether the department was consulted in the decision to cut the funding for the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative?
No, the department was not consulted, Mr. Joyce. When the executive branch put together its budget, it's a very siloed operation, so EPA's conversations are with OMB, and Interior is not consulted or informed about those discussions. Similarly, EPA doesn't know what's happening with the Interior budget formulation. So we had no conversations about EPA's budget.
Well, what are some of the examples of the work that the department does or is currently doing with GLRI funding that would not be continued in fiscal year FY20 if the proposed cut were to be enacted?
Okay, there are a number of activities going on. The Fish and Wildlife Service, for instance, was involved in research and some restoration grants for fisheries habitat and wildlife habitat in the western edge of Lake Erie. There were some grants for Kirtland's warbler and eastern Massasauga rattlesnake restoration, about $350,000 in non-federal matching contributions. And our U.S. Geological Survey also tends to be a fairly significant recipient historically of Great Lakes Restoration Initiative funding.
The Interior's budget proposal, as you know, its investment in recent years in Asian carp control and prevention now easily numbers in the tens of millions of dollars. Would you please take a minute to update the subcommittee on the accomplishments to date with these recent investments in Asian carp control and prevention and your objectives for fiscal year 20 then?
Yes, Mr. Joyce, I'd be happy to do that. As you observed, we've got about $13.5 million in the President's budget for Interior for Asian carp. A good deal of that money has gone to the U.S. Geological Survey. There's been some really interesting research on environmental DNA, so-called eDNA, that enables us to identify where organisms are just by doing water samples. Another example is that we've been looking at U.S. Geological Survey has identified larval grass carp eggs in the Maumee River and in Toledo. And if grass carp get into the Great Lakes, and as you know, there are half a dozen species of Asian carp, but one of the particular threats of grass carp is they eat aquatic vegetation, and not only does that disrupt the ecosystems, but that also means they eat the food for ducks and other aquatic birds that are very important to waterfowl hunters and bird watchers. So the grass carp risk is a particularly significant one. USGS.
I consider it game, set, match if they get into the green.
It would be really bad. There's a $7 billion fishery at stake here, as I know, Mrs. Lawrence and the other members of the subcommittee are very much aware, and that has very significant implications for Michigan's boating industry, tourism, all sorts of things. So it's a very significant issue. Yeah, absolutely.
Well, for the past two budget cycles, our colleagues here, and we certainly welcome Ms. Lawrence to the Great Lakes, colleagues here on this, provided funding to the Fish and Wildlife Service for contract fishery on Asian carp. We did this in direct response to actions called for in management plans. God forbid these things get in the Great Lakes, but we'd really be better off at catching them. Right now, unfortunately, the Mississippi River Basin offers plenty of opportunity to do so. Could you take a minute and update us on what update the subcommittee on what the Fish and Wildlife's efforts to start a contract fishery for Asian carp?
Yes, absolutely, Mr. Joyce. So we are focusing at the leading edge of the invasion, if you will, to try to deplete the populations at the leading edge before they can get as massive as they are in some of the larger rivers. And while the long-term goal, of course, is to eradicate the carp, having a commercial fishery is one of many tools to at least get some of them out of the water. We're working closely with state agencies to manage this effort and to try to engage with commercial fishing operations.
Well, I know I'm past my time, but in closing, years ago I got Ms. McCarthy to admit that it would be good if we could fish those to extinction. I yield back.
That's a very astute observation, I think.
Catch them and eat them. Ms. Pingree.
Thank you very much. Thank you for being here today, Mr. Assistant Secretary and Ms. Flanagan. We appreciate your spending the time with us. And while I don't represent anywhere near the Great Lakes, I've been well versed in Great Lakes support on this committee and have nightmares about the Asian carp while I have never seen one. So please don't cut. I will say the other day, I live in lobster fishing territory, and a lobster fisherman came up to me and said he had just seen a television news item about the Asian carp, and he wanted to know if we could get them to Maine for lobster bait, because we have a bait shortage. So perhaps we could do some...
I'm sure they give you about 10 or 20 million pounds.
We want them frozen and cut up and frozen. But you can ship them to us, and we'll explain the whole process to you. May not be far-fetched, but anyway, I appreciate your being here. And of course, if the Secretary Bernhardt, if Mr. Bernhardt is confirmed as Secretary, we will look forward, of course, to having him as well. And probably some of these questions I'll ask again, but just want to mention a couple of things. Before I start, I just want to go on the record again to explain my strongest possible opposition to the extension of oil and gas drilling lease sales in the Atlantic, Arctic, and Pacific Oceans and the Eastern Gulf of Mexico under the OCS program. Nothing has changed, in my opinion, that this rollback of a decades-old ban on drilling for gas and oil along our coasts is outrageous. It's dangerous. In my home state of Maine, we have a $5.6 billion tourism industry, and 70% of that is dependent on our coast. Of course, we also have 30,000 Mainers who make their living in marine industry, and as I've mentioned, the lobsters are supreme where I am, so we're just deeply concerned. I don't want to change my position on that. I just wanted to state it again. And I do have one question about the department's position on science and climate science research, which is also a great concern to me. I am worried about the effects of the extreme weather, sea level rise, other climate change impacts in my state and, of course, across the nation. For just one example, USGS ecosystems budget is cut by $44 million. Environmental health is completely eliminated, which is a $23 million cut. Last year, it was reported that the department was making deletions from a USGS news release about the role climate change played in rising sea levels. How are you continuing to implement Executive Order 3360, which was signed by Acting Secretary Bernhardt in December of 2017? It rescinds important climate mitigation and conservation policies that would impact the department's ability to promote energy growth and development. And I guess I want to know why this isn't in conflict with the part of the department's mission that is to manage the nation's natural resource and cultural heritage for the benefit and employment of the American people, benefit and enjoyment of the American people.
And employment, too.
Yeah.
So thank you for that question, Ms. Pingree. Interior views our mission as managing land, managing fish and wildlife populations on that land in cooperation typically with state agencies, managing vegetation, whether it's rangeland or forest land. So our our mission is not as central to climate change as the mission of EPA might be, for instance. We don't have the Clean Air Act. So we are focusing on trying to deal with the on-the-ground impacts of environmental change. How can we manage our forests better? How can we manage our rangeland better? And that's our perceived role in dealing with environmental change as an issue. In terms of USGS budget, there are tough choices that we had to make across the entire department. We were given a target by the Office of Management and Budget. We're pleased OMB ultimately gave us almost $1 billion more than was in the President's 2019 request. But yes, they were tough trade-offs and tough decisions. We are trying to invest our USGS science budget, which is still $1 billion, and that's a lot of money, I think, by anyone's analysis, on those aspects of USGS science research that we think will have the greatest benefit in terms of our land and resource management responsibilities.
Well, I can take this up again with Secretary Bernhardt when he returns, but I disagree with you. I think that it is the department, it's the mission of every department right now to deal with the issues around climate change, and certainly the Department of Interior and USGS are key players in that. I want to just quickly ask one other question, if I may, and I can make this quick. As you may know, 5 years ago, we were very thankful that the Beatrice Rafferty School was able to get full funding for construction. Yet we're here in discussing this in fiscal year 2020. We still do not have a shovel in the ground. I can go through all the details. We've had a lot of support from this chair, the former chair, both sides of the aisle, you know, everywhere we go. Yeah. And in 2017, I think we heard we are on track for a spring 2017 construction start. Anyway, fast forward, I've been told that approval of the final paperwork is pending. And after that, the construction funds will be accessible for the school to begin their work. We have a limited construction season in Maine. It would be just great if that could happen by this year. Can you give me an answer about whether the project is approved and what's holding it up these many years?
Well, I can provide a little bit of background, at least, as I know you're aware of. The project was actually managed by the local school board, and one of the challenges initially was that the bids that we got from the construction companies, the school board got from the construction companies, were a lot higher than was originally projected. But I want to make sure I give you the exact correct information, so I'd really like to respond for the record. So I've got all the facts and statistics straight, Ms. Pingree, if you don't mind.
Okay, well, I will check back in with you, but my understanding is it's on someone's desk waiting final approval. So all those decisions have been made and contracts approved, you know, we're there. So it would be great to be able to finish this and put it to bed.
Well, I do know that BIE is preparing their operating plan for 2019, and I promise you by the end of the day, I will go back and check on the status of this particular project.
Thank you very much. I yield back.
That sounds great. Mr. Stewart.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And to the ranking member, Ms. Flanagan, Dr. Cameron, thank you for being here today. It's a difficult process. I know it's amazing to me. I see your folders before you as you're thumbing through, because you've got hundreds of programs you have to be conversant on and have to be able to answer very quickly. And appreciate it, recognizing it's a difficult work. I want to thank you for a couple things and then dive into something. These hearings are a bit eclectic in the sense that they're many times we ask you things not of a broad national scale, but things that are important to our districts or our state or our region. And that's good that we have the opportunity to do that. And I want to do that as well. But before, I want to, again, thank you for a couple things. First, again, for your work you're doing, being here. Second, wild horses, which is an issue that I know the members of this committee are sick to death of me talking about. But it has been a very important issue for my district and for people who care about these animals and care about rangeland in the West. My former chief of staff, Dr. Steed, who I think you know as the acting director of the BLM, he has been incredible on this issue. I have many others in the department, and we have, we think, a very workable agreement now with many of the activist groups, including, well, I tell you what, I'm not going to mention them because I don't want to put them on the spot, but we have a very bipartisan partisan and broad agreement that we think is going to fix that, but we couldn't have done it without the help of your departments, as particularly at the BLM. I thank you for that. Last thing I want to thank you for, a couple of years ago, we had some real concerns with the work environment harassment, and we expressed those. And I know as I go through your testimony here, and I'm not going to read this relevant part, but how the reforms and your interest in fixing that, we think that's important, and congratulate you on that, but please keep pressing forward on that. This isn't the kind of thing that is fixed between, you know, today and the weekend. So please keep leaning into that. And then the last thing, and that is law enforcement. And I got to share a story very quickly. I was with my family. We were camping, although we were actually camping on my own ranch, my father's ranch. And among this group, it was a group of responsible people, is my point. We had a couple military officers, a couple general officers, people who worked in the intelligence community for government. This wasn't a bunch of renegades. And we had a law enforcement official from a public lands agency who came and accused us of illegally hunting and was terribly abusive. And for those of us who are adults, it was, you know, we could handle it, but we had young kids there. And those young kids watched and listened to this, and when that individual left, they did not think he was their friend. And it left a real impression on them. And we've expressed that concern to you in the past, and once again, we appreciate your willingness to make some difficult decisions, particularly in the West, in Utah, with some, what we thought was abuse by some officials with land agencies and law enforcement responsibilities. Thank you for that. Now to my question, if I could. And I'd invite you to respond on any of those issues if you feel like you'd like to. And then very quickly, geothermal is enormously important. I actually am an all of the above kind of guy. In my district, I have supported wind. We have helped to clear the federal red tape on renewable sources of energy on federal lands. It's one of our priorities. So we have wind, we have solar, we have geothermal. I worked with the University of Utah and got tens of millions of dollars of grants for geothermal research. But for these small communities, many of which have enormous, as you know, public lands, and I have one county in my district, 97% controlled by the federal government. Actually 93% federal government, 4% state, but it leaves them with 3%. These revenues from geothermal royalties is incredibly important. 50-50 split is what used to be. Then there was a previous adaptation to that, which gave 25% of the federal royalties to the counties. And it's incredibly important to them. You're proposing taking that back to 50% going to the federal government. Please don't. Could we work with you to maybe look at that again? Because once again, it's not much money to the federal government. It's incredibly important to these very rural counties. Tell us your thoughts on that, if you would.
Thank you, Mr. Steer, for that question. And I appreciate the significance of geothermal energy. Early in my career, I worked for a senator from Nevada. And as you know, geothermal is as important in Nevada as it is in Utah. And we were able to work with former Senator Melcher from Montana to pass geothermal leasing reform legislation that protected our national park geothermal features and encouraged geothermal development. But to your question, we're happy to have a conversation with you about this particular provision in the President's budget. In terms of law enforcement,
Before you go into that, if I could, I will follow up with you on that. We do think it's important, and I recognize what the President is trying to do. We understand you're trying to increase revenue to the Treasury, but again, it's a small amount of money, and these counties, it will have an enormous impact on them. So we'll follow up with you. Thank you for that.
Okay. Yes, sir. Happy to do that. In terms of law enforcement, as not everyone knows, Interior's got the fourth largest law enforcement establishment in the federal government, about 4,000 law enforcement officers, many of whom are actually park rangers, but are deputized law enforcement officers. One of our interests in the last couple of years has been to try to have our law enforcement community project an image of being a helper, being someone who's out there to serve the community as opposed to looking for opportunities to write tickets. And the relationship of law enforcement to communities is an issue nationwide, and it's something we're sensitive to at Interior. It's something we are trying to work on, and because we do want our law enforcement folks to be viewed as public servants. So I'll just leave it at
Okay,
that.
and again, thank you for that, and please keep up those efforts as well. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Ms. Lawrence?
Thank you, Madam Chair. And thank you for being here. How are you? The Asian carp issue, I appreciate that you understand it, you have a grasp on it, but my question is a follow-up. The president's budget cuts the program. What would be the threat that we would face if we cut the program, and what would the reality be?
We hope, thank you, Ms. Lawrence, very good question. We hope we'll never actually experience the reality of that, they'll never actually get into the Great Lakes. What is quite clear is that they've significantly disrupted, the riverine ecosystems where they are right now. There's no doubt about that. And in terms of the funds available to us in the president's budget, and ultimately what the Congress would appropriate, we would be setting priorities. We try to invest in the most valuable research first, and with the research that's most likely to lead to keeping those critters out of the Great Lakes.
Does that include the zebra mussels?
Zebra mussels, so as I suspect you and Ms. McCollum and Mr. Joyce are already quite painfully aware, those things are already all over
Yes.
the Great Lakes. One of the investments in the president's budget is to try to protect Mr. Stewart's district and Mr. Simpson's district and Mr. Kilmer's district from zebra and quagga mussels getting into the Pacific Northwest. And we've invested $9.5 million to keep them out of the Pacific Northwest or from spreading in the West more generally. But work still does continue in the Great Lakes on those zebra and quagga mussels. In fact, there are a lot of lessons learned from the Great Lakes that are applicable to those concerns out west. The biggest threat to the west now from quagga mussels are actually boats coming north from Lake Havasu, Lake Mead, Lake Powell. Greg Sheehan, former Utah Fish and Game Director, told me once that if those mussels got into the tunnels that bring water to Salt Lake City, it could really impede Salt Lake's water supply. So it's a significant municipal and industrial issue. As the Midwestern members of this delegation know well, it's not just an ecological issue.
My other question is, the people who have the guardianship of the Great Lakes are very, very, very concerned about water quality. And I want you to comment on the fact that, again, we're facing a limited budget. And because of the Flint water situation, we're even more sensitive to the issue of water quality. Where does the Department of Interior stand on protecting the water qualities in the largest body of fresh water in the country?
So we participate in the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative. We fund research through the U.S. Geological Survey on water quality monitoring. We do that in conjunction with EPA as well.
Could I ask a question? So one of the things I learned uniquely in the Flint water situation is that those who have the guardianship of water quality must sound the alarm for public awareness. Where does the role of the Interior, if your budget is cut and we're looking at water quality and you're outlining all these things you're supposed to do, if the budget is cut and you're not able to achieve that, who sounds the alarm? Who makes sure that it's not a budgetary decision, which we know that's what happened in Flint. EPA was aware of it. So you talk about EPA, and I want to know, where does the Department of Interior have the responsibility to sound the alarm if you do not have the funding to ensure that we're protecting the water quality?
So our role is to provide data, scientific information to the regulatory agencies, whether it's the State Department of Environmental Protection or US EPA. And typically, it's a state government that actually has the regulatory role, both in terms of the Clean Water Act and the Safe Drinking Water Act. So we can provide them the scientific information, whatever amount of money we end up getting from the Congress in terms of the U.S. Geological Survey Water Program, we will prioritize that to so that we are addressing the highest priority risks, both in terms of human health and ecosystem
Is there an
protection.
internal system for you to create a sense of awareness if it ever gets to that point that you are not fulfilling your requirement based on budgetary concerns?
We are in regular communication with the State Department's Environmental Protection and with US EPA. And if we identify through our monitoring some significant problem, then we'd communicate that in close to real time.
Okay. Thank you.
Yep, my pleasure.
Thank you. Mr. Joyce, we're going to give Mr. Amade a chance to settle in, so I'm going to ask the next question. Since 2017, the department has imposed and reviewed all of the grants and cooperative agreements over $50,000. And it has led to significant delays in distributing funds. Grant recipients have faced uncertainty and they've been forced to make difficult decisions. For example, even though we congressionally direct funding for natural heritage areas, the department has included them in this review. And I want to state again, this Congress has directed funding for the national heritage areas. The consequence of this layer of bureaucracy, the Mormon Pioneer National Heritage Area in Utah lost $525,000 in leveraged funds, and funds at the Northern Rio Grande Natural Heritage Area was forced to cancel its spring cycle. And these were congressionally directed funding. So, Mr. Cameron, you issued a memo in 2017 notifying the DOI offices of this new policy. You decided this. Your office conducts the reviews. In FY 2018, how many discretionary grants and agreements were reviewed by the department? Of those, how many were denied and for what reason? In FY 2018, was the average length of time for grants and agreements to clear the review process? In other words, how long did it take in 2018? And what was the average length of time prior to implementation of this review? And this is particularly disturbing to me because I literally had to make a phone call in December about what was going on with at our universities with some of the grants in the climate adaptation centers, which are also being proposed to cut. So one wonders if grants aren't issued because the administration just is looking to scale this back and doesn't support the climate adaptation science centers. The funds were finally released, but these funds should not have taken a phone call because they were congressionally mandated. Will you please explain to us the logic behind of what you're doing, how many you've denied, and for what reasons?
Okay. Chairman Collum, I appreciate that question. So perhaps to try to put this in a little bit of context, when Secretary Zinke came into office in March of 2017, he was getting an orientation to the department. And he learned that about $5 billion, somewhere around 30 to 40% of our total budget was going out the door in terms of financial assistance. So he not surprisingly asked some basic questions. Where is that money going? What is it good for? Is it accomplishing it?
Who gave him that briefing?
The department's budget staff.
The department's budget staff
Right.
on their own came up with that briefing. Okay.
Yeah, it was a basic introduction. This is the Department of Interior. This is the organization that you've been confirmed to lead. So he asked a series of questions about where is the money going? How do we know we're getting anything out of it? And around the same time, we were getting, it seemed like a couple of times a week, an IG report on some grant or some cooperative agreement to somebody somewhere being in violation of some law, being in violation of some reg, dollars not being accounted for. So we got the clear sense that there were problems based on what the Inspector General had told us in our financial assistance programs. So Secretary Zinke decided at that point that we needed to take a closer look about where those $5 billion were going every year.
So just to clarify, so we always appreciate the Inspector General's work. They were finding issues, but were they finding issues every place, or were there issues in certain targeted areas? Like, for example, where the science centers I referred to, or the national heritage areas, were they places that were having problems? We can look at the reports, but I would hope you would have known that, because
Actually, I think the disproportionate number were with respect to Pittman-Robertson and Dingell-Johnson grants, which of course this committee doesn't have jurisdiction over because they're mandatory funding. But it's fair to say that there were very few grant programs across the entire department that did not have some problem somewhere that the Inspector General, had uncovered. Be happy to try to provide you a little bit more detail. So we went down. We also discovered at that point that back in 2014, OMB had published government-wide guidance that agencies were supposed to publish regulations on financial assistance, and Interior had never gotten around to doing that.
Did that need to happen when Congress has, was that across the board in everything that you grant?
Let me back up to that rulemaking process did not interfere with our ability to process grants. My point is that the department had not fulfilled direction from OMB to tighten up on how grants are administered. Just a week or so ago, we in fact published a proposed rule to finally make good on that.
So how long is it going to take you to approve grants now? And are you still going all the way down to the $50,000 level? We want no fraud, waste, or abuse. We all agree on that.
Right.
But you have to prioritize, and some grants that are mandated by Congress and have longstanding history of not having a problem, I hope I don't have to, Mr. Joyce and I don't have to call in December again to have the universities have their grants put in place.
I certainly hope you don't have to, neither one of you or any member of Congress for that matter. So since that memo that I signed back in 2017 also indicated that we would be working with the Bureau directors and assistant secretaries on streamlined processes for grant approval. We in fact have been doing that. And in terms of the grants that actually come up to policy management and budget for review out of those assistant secretaries' offices, we are typically clearing those in a matter of days, like 3 days, 5 days, 7 work days. So I can tell you with a high degree of confidence that if there's a bottleneck in the system, it is not in PMB.
I'm just going to ask one question, then
Sure.
I want to follow up, and then I want to turn over to my colleagues on the other side of the aisle, because we can get some more information back and forth on this. But the shutdown, are you caught up from the shutdown for grants, or are those grants still in a backlog?
I believe we are caught up. The shutdown slowed down our Bureau activity, no doubt about it. And that was a problem. And of course, as we all know, we finally got a signed appropriations bill a little bit later in the fiscal year than one might have hoped, and that is a factor in getting the $19 out the door. But it's my understanding that we have caught up.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Amade. Would you like Mr. Joyce to go next, or are you ready to go?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'd like to go, if it's okay with you.
It's okay with me. Go for it, Mr.
Thank
Amade.
you. And I apologize for my tardiness, but I was up at Financial Services and General Government where the director of OMB was testifying about money things of all things. And so we discussed a little bit of interior stuff. So I'm, believe it or not, happy to be here, not just patronizing, as you might suspect.
Mr. Joyce and I want a full report from you.
I'd be happy to.
And if he offered you more money, I'd like to know that too, Mr. Amadei.
Actually, we had a little discussion about that, so we'll start this one with the same thing. And I want to focus, assuming there's a couple of rounds, but if there's not, that's my problem. But across several administrations now, so it's not Democrats and Republicans or anything else like that, but I try to visit BLM district offices once a quarter. Matter of fact, the chair's been by the Winnemucca BLM district office, which is the last one that I've been to. I ask them all the same question the whole time I've been here. How many positions are you authorized, and how many do you have filled right now? And you know what? And it's not unique to that one, so don't anybody call Winnemucca and say, hey, you ratted us out, and we're going to send you to Winnemucca to punish you. And by the way, that is really a town in Nevada. It's not a Yiddish swear word, Madam Chair. Yes. For once, I'm telling the truth. But anyhow, they're about a third down. Out of 120-ish positions, they've got about 80 filled. And so I started this conversation with Ms. Ferreter, who I believe was your predecessor, and I said, hey, this isn't positions that were added with somebody trying to build an empire. These are positions which have been on the books for a long, long time. And while I can't speak for other jurisdictions, I can speak for interior agencies who own, I'll get rid of defense, but you got BLM with a third of the state. You got Forest Service with some more, which is not interior, it's ag, but you got Bureau of Rec with some more. And so somewhere between, the high number is 85%, BLM's a third, so somewhere between 67 and 85 is what this federal land management agency controls, or agencies. And when they are consistently funded at 67% of authorized, which is not new authorization, somebody needs to take the bull by the horn, since we're speaking about the West, and say, you've either got too many positions, or we're really going to make sure that you have the resources to fund those things. Because when you add on to that, the fact that it's one of the fastest growing percentage-wise states in the Southwest, and you own no bigger estate, the federal estate is no bigger as a percentage function than it is in that state, to sit there and say, as this administration has done, that federal estate is very important to us, and we don't want to lose a single square foot, and blah, 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 and then say, but by the way, we're not going to staff it with archaeologists, realty specialists, range specialists, all that stuff, 10 years behind in grazing renewal. Now, I'm not saying you should approve them, but it's like, and at some point in time, I think the embarrassment factor has to get in to say, I'm not entitled to like what your agency people do in my state, but I am entitled to think that they're going to be appropriately staffed so that whatever discretion they use is done. And I had this conversation at the beginning of this administration, and I can tell you, here's my challenge to you, basically it's been crickets. Now, I know there's been stuff going on and whatever. I'm just saying, is it going to be different now where somebody says, okay, here you go, here's what we're going to do? Because quite frankly, to look at these things and have them say, we value the federal estate in everywhere, and we don't want to lose a single bit of it, but we're not going to staff it, quite frankly to me, maybe I'm missing something, makes no common sense at all. If you value it, then staff it up so you're paying the attention that your own internal documents say you should. Any response?
I guess I'd respond on a couple of levels, Mr. Amadei, to that. I understand what you're talking about. Early in my career, I worked for Senator Chick Heck from Nevada. I spent a lot of quality time in Winnemucca, Elko.
Watch your language now.
And they're hard to find a prettier place in the country than the Ruby Mountains in the Elko district of BLM. In our budget decisions, we have deliberately tried to protect, or to some cases increase our spending on the land management agencies. And the result of that, quite frankly, is we've taken a good deal of criticism for the cuts in grant programs and some other programs of the department. Maintaining or shoring up our ability to deal with visitor services, customer relationships at BLM, Park Service, Fish and Wildlife Service, is a priority. There's no doubt about it. But yes, there are, continuing challenges. I suspect the folks in the Winnemucca District Office could tell you about how they have fewer dollars per acre than the Forest Service does, for instance, but I won't go there today. So there are a series of challenges there. We have increased BLM 164 million in the 20 requests compared to our 19 president's budget, for instance. Fish and Wildlife Service is up 100 million comparing those two requests. But yes, there are tough decisions, and we are trying to weigh more heavily in terms of the land management agencies.
Well, and I thank you, and I'll yield back for this round. I'll just say this, Winnemucca is not unique. All 6 district offices, the state office. So when I hear those numbers from you, you of course realize that when I call and say, hey, I'd like to have somebody walk me through those increases, where they actually hit the ground, if they do, that would be a conversation I'll be looking forward to.
Yeah, I understand that. And one of the things we're trying to do, Mr. Amadei, is look for ways to economize on some of the back office functions, the procurement function, the information technology, human resources, to try to preserve the number of FTE actually delivering services on the ground.
Thank you, Mr. Joyce.
Thank you, Madam Chair. In addition to the few things I mentioned in my opening statement, another bright spot in the FY20 budget proposal is the $800,000 increase to the Fish and Wildlife Service International Affairs Program in order to increase efforts to fight wildlife trafficking. This is an area of budget where the department has routinely requested funding increases over years, and Congress has been happy to oblige. I think we can all agree that we want to see the end of trafficking of critically endangered animals. Can you please take a moment to update the subcommittee on the work of the American attachés stationed throughout the world to fight wildlife trafficking and how we are measuring their progress, and also why the proposed $5 million cut from the Multinational Species Conservation Fund grants? Is there a concern about the program's effectiveness?
Okay, thank you, Mr. Joyce, for that question. So our Fish and Wildlife Service Office of Law Enforcement leads investigations on wildlife trafficking. We've got strong relationships with the Department of State. Fish and Wildlife has 7 attachés at U.S. embassies across the globe to gather intelligence and to try to work with local law enforcement on wildlife trafficking. We are in the process of placing additional attachés, hopefully in Vietnam, Brazil, and Kenya. This is a very serious problem. There's no doubt about it, and we take seriously our responsibilities to try to deal with this global issue. And sometimes these illicit receipts are ending up in the hands of people who are also dealing drugs, people who are looking to fund terrorism. So I appreciate the question.
Part of the question, the proposed $5 million cut from the Multinational Species Fund, is there a concern about its effectiveness?
There's not really concern about the effectiveness of the program. This was a trade-off based on our need to set priorities to try to have a few more BLM folks in Nevada, a few more Park Service folks in parks around the country, and try to preserve staffing on the wildlife refuges. So it's simply a matter of trade-offs. And as I indicated earlier, in order to protect on-the-ground staffing, we had to cut a lot of grant programs.
I yield back.
Thank you. I had a question prepared before I read some news articles, and it came across the news yesterday, on the hurricane supplemental. As you know, the 2017 hurricane season was devastating, and Congress appropriated $560 million to the Department for damages caused by Hurricanes Irma, Maria, and Harvey. As of March 13th, the Department is only obligated $113 million, or only 22% of the funds. Why is the Department only obligated 22% of the funds? and I have a breakdown on how it's being spent here. Despite the slow obligation rate, do you anticipate an adequate level of supplemental funding to address all of the department's damages related to the hurricane in 2017? And the reason why I ask is the president in February has asked the department heads to look at ways to cut some of the supplemental funding to Puerto Rico. And so the fact that we're behind 22%, we're only at 20% of the funds obligated. I've been down to Puerto Rico twice, seen the damage down there, especially Forest Service and the park system and the historic preservation funds. And, you know, in fact, in the historic preservation funds, there is $50 million appropriated, and only $31 million obligated, but the percent that's really gone out is even too small to count. So what's the holdup? I mean, Congress is obligated, you know, we have an expectation that you're going to get the job done, and then when it's not done, and then I read things in the paper that the president's asked, folks to look at ways in which to cut back and not provide disaster relief funding. It really makes one uncomfortable that we're not doing our due diligence to our fellow citizens. This would not be happening in Texas. This would not be happening in, in Florida and the other cases, in the other areas that are part of the United States where we have citizens who depend on their federal government to do the job and to do it right.
So, Chair McCollum, I think we share your sort of existential frustration with the slowness of obligations of this money. There are a number of reasons behind that. First of all, the projects that are the subject of this restoration activity, those, since they were triggered by an emergency event, clearly we hadn't been planning those, for years, the way we plan most of our construction projects. So we're literally starting from scratch in terms of architectural and engineering studies, getting contractors, and getting the money out the door. Secondly, because these areas were so broadly hit by these disasters, there is a lot of competition for the attention of contractors and construction companies in that area. That results in a slower process. Our initial recovery, our initial efforts really focused on the immediate needs and temporary solutions to getting facilities open to the extent we could do so safely, for visitors. So now we're focused on the more permanent solutions and hardening new structures so they're less vulnerable to the next hurricane that comes through. But we share your interest in getting that money obligated sooner rather than later, and it's a real challenge. The larger construction projects also naturally take more time than the smaller projects because there's a lot more planning up front.
Well, Mr. Joyce, I would like at some point for you and I to get a briefing about what's going on, because I hear what you're saying, but I don't agree with a lot of what you said, having been to Villegas, seeing what was happening in Fish and Wildlife. Some of these issues have to be resolved. There's another hurricane season just around the corner. Health and safety of even our federal employees, protecting the structures that we currently have are fundamentally important to do. And we saw construction work that was taking place using some of the Youth Conservation Corps and other things like that. So I think we can be flexible in working with you in making sure where there's opportunities to use some other programming opportunities in other areas. And I bring up the Conservation Corps as an example. To give great opportunities for work skills for youth, to maybe kind of help along with things. We use them all across our our interior system. I think we need to be creative about this. And it's, for the record, the money that has been obligated for these funds, it was scrubbed. They were projects that were approved, and those are funds that are not to be looked at, to be cut back on at all, either in the Virgin Islands, if that's part of the discussion too. But Puerto Rico is the only area that I heard. The Virgin Islands is separate because of being in the Insular Affairs area. I understand that, but all those funds need to be protected, and this committee is going to be watching it very, very carefully.
We'd be delighted to have a conversation with you, Chair McCollum, Mr. Joyce, any members of the subcommittee about ways that we could spend that money faster, consistent, with the appropriate regulations and procurement policies. It's something we take very seriously, and I can tell you we have not gotten any signals from anyone that any of that money ought to be rescinded or held back. We want to get it spent as quickly as we can, consistent with the appropriate laws and regulations.
And we'd also like to follow up and talk to you about some of the forts and some of the work that's done there in, I'm probably using the wrong word, forgive me, but it's the equivalent of tuck pointing in Minnesota.
Right.
That sometimes when outside contractors come in, they do a job and the job doesn't hold up because they don't have the expertise of some of the locals who are on site. So we look forward to working with you on that and expediting things. Thank you. Mr. Quigley.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. I apologize for being late. I was chairing a meeting upstairs, and I didn't make sure that Mr. Amade and Mr. Joyce got to the bottom of their questions. We were able to succeed. While I was gone, I understood you referenced climate change and noticed the U.S. EPA's responsibility there, but your concern was what's on the ground. Is that somewhat accurate?
Yes, sir. We view our responsibility of managing forests, managing rangelands in response to environmental change, and dealing with water resources where we have responsibility for
And
them.
sir, given that, I do something called a climate tour where we go to the national parks and we talk to the experts about how climate change is impacting the national parks. We were in the Rocky Mountain National Park, noticing the mountains filled with multiple gray skeletons that used to be trees due to the beetle and the impacts of climate change there, as well as the Everglades in Florida and the extraordinary impacts there. Given all that, in 2002, after a particularly challenging wildland fire season, DOI and USDA collaborated on a report to Congress recommending steps to help mitigate fires going forward. A key component of that finding was the discussion about the importance of long-term commitment to the use of native plants, materials, and federal land management. Yet, sir, your budget proposes to eliminate funding for this program entirely. So it's not the EPA's responsibility because it's, climate change is theirs, except when it's on the ground. Well, here it's on the ground and it's addressing this issue and it's zeroed out.
Mr. Quigley, I have to get back to you on that specific item. I'm not aware of that line item in the BLM budget. I will say that as a general principle, we do prefer to do restoration with native plants. There are a few exceptions where in an ecosystem that's so severely damaged, you may need to use a non-invasive exotic, initially like crested wheatgrass, for instance, in the Great Basin. But we'll get back to you for the record, if you will, on that particular budgetary reference.
Okay. During the shutdown, the memorandum of understanding between GSA and the National Park Service for the operation of the observational tower at the top of the old post office expired. That facility is, of course, one of the highest profile properties, GSA and NPS real estate profile. Despite the shutdown, the MOU was renewed. Under what conditions could the National Park Service have the budget authority to execute an MOU like this during a shutdown?
I have no specific information on that event and that transaction, and again, I'll have to get back to you for the record on that. With respect to one aspect of your earlier question on forest management and wildland fire, we anticipate any day now the administration will send up to the Congress a comprehensive legislative proposal on active forest management that we think will reduce the wildland fire risk and damage to public health.
Will it be cost-free?
I'm not sure it's been costed out, quite frankly.
Well, just referencing, sir, that the fact that they zeroed out this plan that has a dramatic impact on mitigating wildfires and addressing climate change, I appreciate the fact that they're coming up with a plan. Having not seen it, I can't comment on it, but I assure you it's not going to be particularly useful if there aren't resources behind it. But I thank you.
There are significant resources in our wildland fire budget, but we'll get back to you on the details, Mr. Quigley, on that particular line item.
And on the second item on the old post office.
Yes, sir, we'll do.
Very good. I'm 0 for 2, but thank you, Madam Chairman.
I apologize for letting you down, Mr. Quigley.
Mr. Quigley, I look forward to getting.
10 years, you get used to it.
Yeah, I look forward to getting the information. We were earlier having a discussion about how grants that with directed funds from Congress at $50,000 went all the way up the flagpole to be approved. You would think the post office would have too. Mr. Amade and then Ms. Pingree.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Cameron, to keep going a little farther down the road that Mr. Quigley started, when I looked at what came out of the 19 compromise stuff, when we talk about fire preparedness and fuels management and all that stuff that kind of rolls into climate change, it looked to me like 10 million was taken out of preparedness and 10 million was put in to facilities. Can you, just off the top of your head, because preparedness sounds pretty important to me as a state who, as you know from your experience in the last 20 years, has burned about 10 million acres. What are facilities, and I guess what I'm looking for is why were facilities more important for purposes of finishing up than preparedness?
Okay, so I've got a few numbers for you. In terms of suppression operations, we are basically in 2020, we're basically at the 2019 CR level. And unfortunately, we put together our budget request. It was respect to the continuing resolution as opposed to the enacted, given the time frame of the number crunching on the budget. So we're pretty much flat at about 380 million for suppression.
Let me stop you there, because what I'm saying is that amount that finished out 2019 is my question, which was, how come we down preparedness, not suppression? Preparedness is before the fire starts.
Right, well, preparedness is at the 2019 CR level of 333 million.
But that's my point. If you go to 18, I think it was grown at the expense, preparedness was shrunken at the expense of facilities. So I believe that to be a fact, and if I'm wrong, please tune me up offline, not in public, please. That happens enough. But it's like, what is facilities? Help me understand facilities, how facilities, and listen, this is a decision that Congress made, so I'm not necessarily blaming you. It's just that I think this goes against what your fire people would say.
Right. So there's nothing explicitly in the president's budget request for facilities, which is why I'm frankly stumbling around a little bit in terms of fire-related facilities. So maybe it's a definitional issue here.
Well, and that's fine. So if we do some homework on that, then you're not going to be throwing eggs at our houses because we tuned up preparedness over facilities, potentially.
We are, we're always interested in what the Congress wants to do, and we realize you folks get to appropriate the money. We just get to present a budget, and happy to work with the subcommittee on any and all topics of interest.
A true professional, I appreciate that. Tell me about funding for the reorganization.
Okay, so there is $27.5 million requested for reorganization in the president's budget for Interior. That is spread across most of our bureaus. There's a good deal of emphasis on standing up the unified regions. We now have 12 unified regions. We've gone from each of our bureaus having its own different regional structure to having unified regions, except for the bureaus engaged in Indian country because they were not interested in participating in the unified region effort. So
No,
there's,
that's fine. If I'm not trying to cut you off, but,
Okay.
but I just have one more and then I'll. So could you describe to me that budget amount for what you feel like congressional liaison has been in terms of keeping people with major interests in how Interior functions, especially a reorganization? Because the reason I'm asking you the question is, as a guy who you know from your past, it's like kind of important what Interior does. It's been very hard for us to get updates.
okay, well, we would not anticipate, for instance, any changes in the budget offices of our bureaus, and not anticipate any changes in the congressional relations offices of our bureaus. Those people would not be leaving.
I think you've misunderstood me.
I'm sorry.
For me to embrace a potential reorganization means I would have to know what it would do
Right.
and how it would affect, to start, Nevada. And what I'm telling you is information from Interior on here's where we're at the moment, or here's where we're not at, has been very hard to get, and that's being generous.
Okay, point well taken. I suspect you're not alone in that perception.
We've asked.
I know. So we just got our 19 appropriation a little bit more than a month ago. So that was the first installment of funding on the reorganization. So we are in the process of coming up with plans for how we'd spend the 19 money, and how we spend the 20 money to some extent depends upon how we spend the 19 money. We are confident that by standing up unified regions and by having an individual in the role of Interior Regional Director within those unified regions whose responsibility is to try to coordinate the bureaus inside those regions, that your constituents and the constituents of every member of this subcommittee will find it easier to get decisions from the department, because you'll have someone responsible at a regional level for making relatively more of the decisions, as opposed to someone in an assistant secretary's office in Washington making those decisions.
Mr. Cameron, I appreciate you saying that, but I am going to stop you because Congress is who you have to report to. There had been problems with reports. We had a promise from the Secretary that all the reprogramming would be going through. We had a promise from the Secretary, and even working with Acting Secretary Bernhardt, that we would be fully encompassed in it. And then your comment about Indian country, and I think this is a bigger discussion we'll have to have after Secretary Bernhardt is, but I just want to clear something for the record. Indian country was asked after the fact, after the regions were drawn, after the ink was starting to dry on the paper, do you like this? They weren't consulted in early, and they said, if we're not going to be consulted, then we're not going to be part of this. And so one of the things that we were hoping is that partners would be consulted, and that's why I think this discussion, as you can see, needs to be with the Secretary later on, because those are letters and agreements and emails that have been shared with staff between Mr. Bernhardt, our staff, and myself, and others. So let's let that one lie. That, as you know, that's going to be a big issue coming up. Vice Chair Pingree?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I want to just cover two topics, and so quickly I'm going to go over, there's been a lot of back and forth about delayed funding and review, and I just want to add one more to the mix that raises concerns for me in Maine. We have, this is about park fee projects under lengthy new review. In Maine, we have Acadia National Park and now Catawba Woods and Waters Monument. So they're very important to us, and my understanding is that there's been a hold on executing park and program recreation fee projects not yet underway, and also some underway. So I guess my question, and maybe just put it in the mix, I don't need a lengthy answer, but it just seems like this is unusual. There's some concerns. Why is the Department of Interior bringing these projects all the way up to the top level and delaying them when they're fee projects?
So my understanding, and we can double check this when I get back to you, but my understanding is that the Park Service has, as of today or perhaps as of yesterday, released those funds, and that those projects should be approved down to the regional level. There was a quick review. We wanted to make sure that the projects that we are providing funding for were consistent, with the authorized purposes under FLORIA, especially.
So you're saying this isn't an ongoing review? It was just a one-time sort of checking out what's going on?
That's my understanding, yeah.
So can you just clarify for me that that's true?
Yes, ma'am.
And if there's any difference? Okay.
Will do.
Let me just bring up the Endangered Species Act, which is always interesting topic in this committee, and I know we all have different experiences with the Endangered Species Act in our home state. I'm lucky enough to come from Maine, and we are one of those states where we've seen the phenomenal success story of the return of the bald eagle. And I know we're all American patriots here, so we are very glad to know that they've come back. There were 21 nesting pairs in 1967, and today there are 733 nesting pairs. And this weekend, as I frequently do, got to watch them building a nest right near where I live. So it's wonderful to see that return, and that is largely due to the Endangered Species Act, and in particular in their case because of the restrictions on DDT. But now there are some reports that the administration has proposed drastic changes to the Endangered Species Act. Some of those include just today, there was reports the department has supposedly intervened to direct Fish and Wildlife Service to begin a new process applying narrower standards to determine the risk from 3 pesticides that have put hundreds of endangered species like the kit fox and seaside sparrow at risk, again, DDT. And that pesticide was, part of what changed things for the bald eagle. We already know that the administration has a proposal to allow economic factors to be considered during the listing of species, and I think that raises some problems. So if this is allowed to go forward, how will U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service determine a value of the species? Won't this automatically lead to a reduction? I'm equally concerned that the rules state that wildlife managers would be allowed to ignore threats from climate change. And of course, that's a continuing theme here. We're worried that the Department of Interior is not taking this seriously enough. And if a species is in danger of extinction from climate change or something else, why would we want managers to ignore that factor? How is climate change currently being considered in species recovery plans?
Okay, so the regulatory changes that you referred to, Ms. Pingree, are obviously part of a rulemaking process. We are collecting public comments on that rulemaking. I've got no particular inside information on what the department's decision-making process is with regard to that rulemaking activity. That's owned and operated by the Fish and Wildlife Service, that whole rulemaking activity. So we got a lot of comments, and I am not in a position to suggest what might come out at the end of the rulemaking process. I will observe that in terms of our budget for the Endangered Species Act, we are emphasizing consultation and recovery. We'd like to have more bald eagle type success stories, and we think by investing in recovery, we're likely to have more of that. And we're investing also in the consultation process so that the Fish and Wildlife Service has the resource to have the conversations it needs to have with the Corps of Engineers or the Bureau of Reclamation or other federal agencies on projects that they might pursue that could potentially have an impact on endangered species. So that's where our emphasis is, on consultation and recovery in our budget.
Well, thank you. You've heard my concerns, and I will certainly do a little more research on how your emphasis on consultation and recovery may impact endangered species overall. So thank you for your answer.
Yes, ma'am.
Mr. Simpson, before I go to you, Mr. Amade, when we were doing the reprogramming, I kind of stepped in because Mr. Cameron was probably not as aware of some of the discussions that we had had. Did you have any follow-up before I go to Mr. Simpson?
No, I think, what I'm gonna do, I think, so it's clear, is just follow on with some requests after the hearing to make sure that I get the info that I need. So thank you very much, Madam Chair.
We would all like the info. Mr. Simpson?
Thank you. First, let me apologize for not being here from the start, but as you know, there are multiple hearings going on, and I was the ranking member on the Energy and Water Committee, that we had Secretary Perry there. But I want to thank you for the hard work that you and Mr. Bernhardt have done making the sage-grouse plans consistent with the state of Idaho, and also for the hard work that you've done on other issues, whether they be quagga mussels or other types of things that have benefited the state, and I really appreciate that. Invasive species. Will the department continue to fund the Safeguarding the West initiative, and has the department identified long-term funding for containment of the lower Colorado, which will ensure watercraft are cleaned, drained, and dried before leaving these waters for states like Idaho?
Yes, Mr. Simpson. So the department's budget request includes $9.5 million, if memory serves me correctly, for quagga and zebra mussels. That will include some funding, of course, continuing in the Great Lakes states, but we're particularly concerned, as you observed, about the risk of quagga mussels coming essentially up the Colorado River from Lake Havasu, Lake Mead, and Lake Powell, and getting into Utah, getting into Lake Tahoe, or getting into the Columbia River Basin more generally. And in particular, in the BLM budget, we've requested $1 million increase so that BLM could work with the states of Arizona and California in Lake Havasu. We think we've got the situation more or less under control in Lake Powell. Things are definitely improving. I think Idaho Fish and Game would agree in terms of management in Lake Mead. So right now, Lake Havasu in Arizona and California is the weak spot, if you will, that poses probably the most significant threat to those mussels moving north. So we'd like to call the committee's attention to that $1 million increase and hope that you'd be able to support that.
Thank you. Regarding the right-of-way bonding with the BLM, I've heard concerns from utility companies. I've been contacted by from utility companies that have concerns about the BLM's right-of-way bonding requirement proposed by the last administration. This proposal was done through an interim instruction memorandum. Does the BLM plan to move forward with this proposal?
To be honest, I'm not familiar with that, so we'll have to look into it and reply for the record.
Okay. With regard to FLTFA, FLTFA.
Federal Lands Transaction Facilitation
Yeah.
Act, I think.
Do you have a timeline on implementation for this? I've heard that since the shutdown ended, there have been delays in BIA's Pacific Northwest region in sending to tribes their base funding for the remainder of this year, and that the region has not sent tribes their FY19 contract support cost funding. Is this true, and is there a reason? That's kind of two questions.
Right. I appreciate the question. With the government shutdown and the relative late timing of the 19 appropriation, frankly, we've had to operate on all cylinders to restart the department and get programs running. So I suspect that some of the delays are associated with the combination of the shutdown and the timing of the 19 appropriation. But I want to give you a more specific and more accurate response, and I think I'll need to respond for the record for that one as well.
And with regard to the FLTFA?
Yeah, so land exchanges continue to be a great interest to the department, especially in light of the fact that it's been observed that the president's budget does not include significant amounts of new funding for new land acquisition. We'd like to take advantage of land exchanges to meet some of our resource management needs, including providing more public access to existing lands. So that's a priority for us, and we will be pushing forward on that.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Mr. Cameron, at the end of 2017, the Republican-led Congress passed a tax cut bill. Title II of that bill was language directing the Secretary to open the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge to oil drilling. The bill mandated no less than 2 leases within 10 years, each of the lease sales comprising no less than 400,000 acres. The professed reason for the sale was to raise $1 billion over a 10-year period that would be used to offset the projected $1.5 trillion cost of the tax cut. December 15, 2017, the Congressional Budget Office produced a letter which scored ANWR's provision as raising $1.1 billion of revenue over 10 years. CBO stated in the letter that $500 million of the federal share, 46% of the total federal revenue, would come about from the lease of sales in fiscal year 2020. Because CBO analysts rely on information and input from the department when they create their scores, I would like to ask you the following 2 questions. Do you have an update on the estimate of the revenues that will come about from the lease sales? And can you tell us how much has been spent by all the interior bureaus on the ANWR legislation since its enactment in 2017?
Okay. On the first question, we do not have an estimate. As I think we're all aware, the oil and gas markets change on a fairly regular basis. So a long line of assumptions that need to be made in any sort of projection on revenues. We are implementing the law. We are in the midst of a NEPA process on the coastal plain, the 1002 area of the coastal plain. The public comment period closed about a week or so ago, more than a week or so ago. We anticipate the final EIS sometime later in 2019. And a record of decision to follow shortly thereafter. We would have to do a data call of our bureaus to find out how much money that they have spent associated with that direction from Congress in the tax bill, and frankly, we just haven't done that. We'd be happy to engage in that data call, though, if you'd like, Chair McCollum.
I would like that. So CBO was able to state that $500 million of the federal share, 46% of the federal total revenue, would come from these lease sales in fiscal 2020. So someone felt that they could make a projection. So can you give, are you gonna be updating that projection on and off over the years, working with CBO as other things look at and changing in case oil revenue goes substantially down and we find ourselves, this was added to the tax bill at the end without much debate and used to offset the cost of the tax cuts. I think it's very important as Congress moves forward in working towards its budgets that we have an idea as to whether or not these estimated revenues are going to be on target.
Yeah, I can assure you that there will be at least annual conversations with both OMB and CBO on this point, because in the process of estimating the federal deficit or surplus in any given year, we have to re-examine the projections for all mandatory streams of funding. So yes, there will be regular and ongoing conversations from year to year.
And I really would like to know how much the Interior Department's going to be spending on the sale, because it was added to the tax bill. Mm-hmm. We didn't have a chance to have any input as to how it would affect some of our other programming costs. And I'm asking for a bigger allocation, Mr. Simpson. I wake up every day hopeful and optimistic, but if we don't get it, we're going to be paying for this this tax cut indirectly. Mr. Simpson, do you have another question?
I was going to say, the one thing I can tell you is that the estimated revenue will not be accurate. It'll either be higher or lower. But trying to project it accurately and on the dollar is almost impossible. Like, you can't project the budget deficit or anything else. It's just a guesstimate. And I don't know whether it'll be higher or lower, but I would like to be kept updated on what's going on there.
Yeah, and I'll speak for myself. That's why I think it was a foolish thing to use the ANWR lease sales for one of 2 reasons. One, it's a very fragile federal asset that I think should be protected for future generations. But secondly, because you can't project what the revenue is going to be to use that to offset tax cuts. Mr. Simpson, do you have another question?
No.
I want to maybe just ask one more on landscape cooperatives, and then thank you so much for being here and answering our questions. We look forward to working with you. And the secretary should he be confirmed, and it appears that he will be. So the landscape conservation cooperatives, in the fiscal year 2019 omnibus bill, Congress approved $12.5 million for the existing 22 landscape conservation cooperatives. With that funding, Congress stipulated that prior to making any changes to the program, U.S. Fish and Wildlife must, 1, officially present a description of those changes to the committee, and 2, provide an opportunity for public view and comment. We are hearing disturbing reports from outside groups and concerned citizens that the Landscape Conservation Cooperative Program is being altered and may not receive any federal funding, and nearly 1/3 of them are no longer even operating. So can you tell me, or get back to us within a week, the status of the 22 landscape conservation cooperatives? And is the department planning to formally notify the committees of any changes to the program?
We will definitely get back to you within a week on the status of those 22 cooperatives. Chair McCollum, I'm happy to do that, and information on what the service is doing with the program. At a high level, I can say that the service has been following the 2018 report language that from this committee that directed it to put relatively more emphasis on those cooperatives that appear to be more successful or more engaged. But I'm happy to be, more fully responsive per your, request within a week.
We'll follow up on that. Well, once again, I would like very much to thank you for coming, Mr. Cameron, and filling in. We needed to get the budget process started. We look forward to seeing Mr. Bernhardt in the future. Ms. Flanagan, you were the silent partner in making sure everything stayed on track. Nobody heard you say a word, but you got the job done. With that, I adjourn. Thank you.
Thank you.
Everybody got done early.
It's because members were.